So FemTech stands for female technology, and it's technology focused on female bodies and women's health. Anything from fertility to birth and menopause, but also going beyond the uterus to include things like bone health and heart health, because women's health is not just about reproductive health, but it's about all of our different health aspects.
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Marina Gerner. Marina is a financial journalist, a professor, a columnist, and an author. In her award-winning book, The Vagina Business, The Innovative Breakthroughs That Could Change Everything in Women's Health, she does a deep dive and shares a look behind the scenes of the booming FemTech industry, the commercialization of vaginal health, and the stories, personal and political, that shape how we talk about women and their bodies. So trigger warning, audience, we do say the word vagina, and we speak about women's bodies and other aspects of healthcare, equity, and current trends. You can turn the episode off at any time, now, or decide that you want to amplify and promote the content of today's conversation. I first met Marina at the Porchlight Book Awards celebration in New York City. The Vagina Business won in the Innovation and Creativity category. Sidebar, my own microskills, Small Actions, Big Impact, made the long list of books. When Marina took the stage to accept the award, she shared a quick and impactful story that gave me pause. Let's get to the conversation so we can hear about that story. Not only about the story, but also in general, the stigma, the shame, and the science of FemTech. Did you hear those S's? You know I love alliteration. Okay, let's get to the conversation. Marina, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for our conversation.
So what was that story?
When I accepted the award, they didn't actually expect people to give a speech at all. They said you can just come up on stage and say thank you, and that's it. But I grabbed the microphone and I told people that because I have the word vagina in the title of the book, I've encountered quite a bit of censorship, both online and from people in the industry and in the publishing industry. And so I think oftentimes people think that, we live in the 21st century and we're also progressive, but in reality, a word like vagina is still an issue for a lot of people.
Yeah, and in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, you had to come up with a few comparative titles just in case.
When I first thought of the book, it appeared with the title. I immediately thought of it as The Vagina Business. And then my agent and I went out to sell the book to publishers, and every single publisher said, great book, but you'll have to change the title. And the explanation was that every publishing house has a sales team. And if those sales teams are embarrassed to pitch the book to Barnes & Noble or to Amazon, then you have a bottleneck, you have an issue there. Then my book got sold to the biggest women-owned publishing house in the world. And I thought, okay, great. Now the issue is settled. There'll be no problem here. But they received feedback from independent booksellers and others who were saying they're not going to promote the book. They're not going to display the book. And so my editor got back to me and she said, can you please come up with 16 alternative titles?
Wow.
Which I did. I called two of my best friends and we came up with lots of ideas, including things like When Women Are Well. That was one of the alternatives, which you can see that's a very different vibe, a very different kind of title. And then my publisher tested all of these titles on our target audience. And guess which title won? The Vagina Business. Because I think it really resonates with our target audience because women are tired of euphemisms and they find it refreshing. But the story didn't end there. When the book came out, there was one author who refused to write me a blurb because she said the title was too much. There was a venue who turned me down for trying to have a book launch there because they also thought the title was too much. Sometimes when people review the book on Amazon, it gets flagged as violating community guidelines if they use the word vagina in the review itself, for example. So it keeps coming up and it continues to be an issue. But at the same time, I think it's a very powerful title. And a lot of readers tell me that it really resonates with them. And I get lots of messages from readers actually saying, I'm reading the book on my commute, on the train. I'm reading it at the office. I'm reading it on the plane on purpose to start a conversation or to see how people are reacting.
Prior to the book, you had your PhD, you had your column, and then you wrote an article in 2020 published in Wired magazine. We need to talk about investors' problem with vaginas. An aversion amongst male venture capitalists to talk about vaginas is belittling a whole generation of female entrepreneurs.
I went freelance after being a staff writer at Money Observer, and I started writing about technology as well and about AI because everybody wants stories on AI. And I started writing about health because I was really interested in that. And I've always had an interest in the stories of women and underrepresented voices. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I learned something that I thought was mind blowing. I learned that the symptoms that we typically think of when we imagine a person having a heart attack, and you're a brilliant emergency medicine doctor, so you know this, but the symptoms we typically think of are pressure on the chest and then pain radiating down the left hand side. And every person I ask, would mention those symptoms. And those symptoms are typical for men, they're not typical for women. And as a result, we're much worse at spotting heart health issues in women. Women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed. And that was mind blowing to me to find out that there is this issue. And I also met the founder of a company called Bloomer Tech, and the founder is called Alicia Chong Rodriguez. And what they've created is a smart bra that can help women monitor their heart health. And I really wanted to write about her and tell her story because that's the power I have as a journalist. I can shine a massive spotlight on someone. And I was told the story is niche by various editors, which surprised me because you'd think something that applies to 50% of the population potentially would not be considered niche, but that was the perception at the time. And then COVID happened. And I think during COVID, that's when I finally managed to write the story about the smart bra. And it came out in The Guardian and it did really well. And through that, I got more and more involved in the world of FemTech, the world of women's health innovation.
So many of these FemTech startups are founded by women, but funded by men. How do you think that influences the products and the messages we end up seeing or end up coming to market?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it leads me exactly to the original question you asked, which is when I spoke to founders in that space, anyone with a vagina centric innovation, whether that's birth related or menopause related, all these founders told me they struggled to raise money. So male investors are not actually funding these companies because they're too embarrassed to talk about vaginas. And that's what led me to write the article because I wanted to call out that attitude and I wanted to draw attention to that problem so that people are aware that the reason we're not getting the innovation we clearly want and need and deserve is because there's a bunch of guys somewhere in a boardroom and they don't want to talk about vaginas in front of other guys because something like 90% of VC investors are still men at this point. And then when the article went viral, I realized, okay, there's a case I can make to the publishing world and I'm going to go all out. And I've interviewed 100 people across 15 countries to show everyone that we can look at women's health in a new way and we can create a better, healthier, more inclusive future if we invest in women's health innovation and if we take female health seriously, because for too long, it's been under researched, underfunded, and we have also normalized female pain. I think that's the underlying problem.
But yet, if we flip it, the shame and the stigma actually helps sustain some of these businesses and sort of perpetuates sort of the intrigue.
So, the way I define femtech, female technology, is technology that focuses on female bodies, anything from fertility, menopause, but also going beyond the uterus to things like heart health and bone health. And oftentimes, these companies are consumer focused and digitally enabled, and they're estimated to be a $1 trillion market opportunity. And I define femtech in a way, I would say an idealistic way. I say these are companies that have to move women's health forward. But that's not how everybody uses the term FemTech. And there are lots of snake oil companies and lots of companies I describe as scam tech in this space too. And I think those companies, those bad actors, will often benefit from the shame and the stigma around these things because they make us feel that our bodies are dirty or smelly or that they need to be, hidden or changed, covered up or surgically altered in some way.
How are you different having written this book?
Oh, wow. I've learned a huge amount by writing this book. And I keep learning. It's kind of an infinite topic. And initially, when you're starting out, because you have lived in your body for a few decades, you kind of think you know your own body. But in reality, there's so much more to learn. And I used to think that the menstrual cycle is 28 days long and that I have a slightly abnormal menstrual cycle because it's longer. But in reality, only 13% of women have a 28-day cycle. And you're much more likely to have a cycle that's closer to 30 days. Plus, there's a lot of individual variation. So, how we think about what's normal and what's abnormal, that has changed for me. And just understanding the interplay of hormones and the physiology of birth and the symptoms of menopause. I've learned a huge amount by writing this book.
At the end of the book, you write, I've gone on this journey through the world to FemTech to shine a light on what is possible. I want more innovation for all of us because we deserve better. It's a revolution, and this is only the beginning. What if FemTech wins? So, what if FemTech wins?
Yeah, I was echoing an essay by Gloria Steinem called What If Feminism Wins? And I wanted to show people a future that's not too far off, maybe a few decades down the line, where we take all of these issues seriously and we fund them properly and we regulate them properly, and where every woman is treated with dignity and with respect. And I think it's important to remember that things like the gender economic gap, if you look at statistics from the World Economic Forum, it will take something like 250 years to close that gap. And I didn't want to project that far into the future. I wanted to think of maybe 20 or 30 years. So these structures will still be in place. Most investors will still be men. And I don't think we can wait for parity in that space. I think everybody needs to embrace the topic of women's health and everybody needs to get comfortable with these topics. And I think there are several reasons for why we're not comfortable talking about women's health. One is this idea that the female body is, mysterious. And the way to counter that is by giving people facts and saying, 1 in 3 women has an abortion, 1 in 10 women has endometriosis. Then obviously there's a lot of stigma, as we've said, around terms like vagina. And the only way to overcome stigma is by talking about it.
It's graduation season, and guess what? There's a perfect gift for anyone taking the next big step. It's called Microskills, Small Actions, Big Impact, co-authored by Dr. Resa E. Lewis. This book breaks down success into specific intentional behaviors that anyone can develop, whether you're a student entering the workforce or simply wanting to improve your daily interactions, and who wouldn't want to do that? These evidence-based techniques will transform how you communicate and present yourself. What makes this book so special is that it doesn't offer generic advice. It provides actionable resources that make a real difference in all aspects of your life. Available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook formats wherever you get your books. And if you're looking to bring microskills to your organization or student group, reach out to Dr. Lewis directly via LinkedIn or through her website. Remember, Microskills, your go-to graduation gift that keeps on giving throughout life's journey.
When did you realize that you had your voice, and when did you start using your voice?
I think I've always felt that I've had a voice, but I've used that voice in different ways. I used to be very involved in student politics and so on. And I've always felt I have a strong voice as a writer. And I think one of the other things that led me to this topic is that I cover so many different stories. And for a topic like women's health innovation, you need that interdisciplinary view. Otherwise, you won't get the full picture. If you only looked at the cultural side of things, you would miss the whole financial underpinning of it. If you only looked at the business case, you would say, wow, it's a $1 trillion opportunity. Like, why aren't people investing? So my somewhat idiosyncratic collection of interests and my area of expertise came together really nicely for this particular topic.
100%. AI. You mentioned at the top of the episode that everybody's talking about AI. Where does AI play a role in your work now?
A lot of femtech companies are using AI, and one really good example is in the embryo selection for IVF. When you're doing IVF, you want to select the most viable embryo, and an embryologist would do that in different ways by looking at how the cells are dividing and also sometimes doing some genetic testing. And AI has already been shown to be able to help with the selection of the embryo. So that's already being used. But at the same time, I think we have to be aware that AI uses existing data sets. And so the danger with something like women's health, because we have so many data gaps, is that we amplify existing biases. And one thing I did recently, Canva, the design platform.
Sure.
So they have an AI section where you can create images. And I went onto that section and I put in ovaries, and immediately it was censored. It was flagged as like, oh, this term violates our guidelines. I was like, okay. And it was not vagina. I didn't even try putting in vagina. That's an obvious one. But ovaries, you would have thought, they could show you something. And then I put in uterus, and it showed me a picture of a made up organ. It was definitely not a uterus. Like, who the hell knows what it was, but it was not a uterus. So that's a very kind of quick example of how AI can perpetuate censorship and stigma and also misinformation.
Is AI playing a role at all in your writing? Like, do you use tools to check your grammar or help create a skeleton of an article or generate ideas?
Oh, I wrote my book before ChatGPT came out. And no, I haven't used it in my articles. I have a newsletter that I write about women's health innovation on Substack. And so I've used ChatGPT as a copy editor. I've said, can you copy edit this? And then it found a few missing commas, and that was quite helpful.
In your book, you interview many founders. You talk about many products and different phases of women's health and the life cycle. I have a prolapse story and a pessary story. So when I was a doctor in training, there was a patient that came in from a nursing home and she had sepsis. So she had infection that was spread throughout her body and affecting all of her organs. And when someone comes in sick and infected to the point of sepsis, what we do is we look for a source. What's causing the infection? And could not find the source, could not find the source, could not find a source until it turns out she had a pessary that no one knew about and was not documented in her paperwork. She was not in a state to verbalize what was wrong with her or if anything hurt.
Mm.
And I had never even heard of a pessary. The training in medical school and the training in residency was pretty limited. And there wasn't a lot being talked about in terms of gynecology and the gynecologic exam after a certain age, but also talking about pelvic floor and what happens to women as they age in the pelvic floor, enter vaginal prolapse. And so it turned out that this patient had a pessary, which is a device to hold the prolapse up in place, and no one knew. And that was the source of the infection that had caused a full body sepsis for this patient.
Mm.
And I was delighted and glad that you covered even pessaries and prolapse. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about the FemTech in that space.
Yeah. So I've covered not only companies, but also research projects and nonprofits. And there's an online community led by a woman called Sherry Palm. She's a real pioneer in this space, and she's a patient advocate, a former patient herself, and she's written several books. She's done some lobbying in this space. And so I've interviewed her and I wrote about her experience. And the experiences of women in different age groups, because there are different types of prolapse and the way to address it varies as well. But what I thought was astounding is that, according to some estimates, it affects 50% of women. 50% of women. And it's not something that's widely spoken about. And a lot of people have never even heard of the pelvic floor. So when I was pregnant here in the UK, you do these birth preparation classes. And the midwife who was leading it, she asked our group, who has heard of the pelvic floor before? And nobody's hand went up. And obviously, I write about women's health. So I was just sitting there shocked, thinking, wow, they've done so much research on strollers and all the different brands of strollers, which I had no clue about. But nobody had looked into, their own bodies.
Yeah. How have you navigated as a journalist, PhD not in healthcare per se, speaking often in front of actually a lot of healthcare audiences?
Yeah, that surprised me initially because I thought, I'm writing a business book and it will speak to women in tech and female entrepreneurs and investors and so on. And now I find myself being invited to these big medical research institutions where my audience consists of gynecologists, and they're all sitting there and they're all nodding. And sometimes, just recently, a doctor came up to me at a conference and he said, everything you said really resonated with me. And I'm ashamed to think that we normalized all of these things and that we told women, yeah, that's normal, extreme period pain or painful IUD insertion or whatever it may be. And that's really fascinating to me. I think because so many medical professionals are not trained in menopause and do not follow the most recent innovation and so on, they really value those insights and they value that I'm coming at it from a different perspective. And that's been really nice to see.
It would be hard to generalize. And also, I'm going to ask you a question that asks you to generalize. What has been the male response? What do men say about the book?
What's amazing is that those men who get it, they really get it. They become super fans. And there have been several men who, have invited me onto their podcast. There was one guy in London who leads a wealth management company, and he invited me to speak at his company's Christmas party for his clients.
I love that.
And that was a very different audience because a lot of the time I mainly speak to women, but that was a predominantly male audience in their 60s and 70s. And they were fascinated. They were so interested.
That's great. Marina, thank you so much for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. It always is.
The Resa wrap-up. Special thanks to Dr. Marina Gerner for joining me in conversation. Audience, if you want to keep up on what's happening with Marina, check out her website, www.marinagerner.com. That's MarinaGerner. Find her on LinkedIn, Marina Gerner, PhD, and on Instagram, @Marina Gerner. 2 highlights from the conversation, audience. Number 1, stigma. The stigma surrounding women's health is still prevalent today. Awareness of women's health is lacking in our society. Unfortunately, censorship in publishing can hinder discussions about women's health. The conversation really around women's health needs to be normalized and destigmatized. Next, FemTech. FemTech encompasses a wide range of health issues beyond reproductive health. This represents a significant market opportunity, estimated at $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion. Many female entrepreneurs struggle still to secure funding due to investor biases. That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trends spaces. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Please find me through my website and on social media, Resa E. Lewis, MD, or through the podcast, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please be sure to share the show with a friend. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the institution with which they are affiliated or identified. Information herein should never be used as a substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice.